Hello, everyone, and welcome back. As soon as I started this video, a motorcycle came by. Go figure. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I have some very special guests with me today, Megan and Joshua from Digital Hammurabi. Digital Hammurabi is the creative outlet of Assyriologist Megan Lewis. Assyriologist, did I say that right? Assyriologist, yeah. Driven by a passion for the ancient Near East and the belief that history is both important and relevant to modern life. I could not agree more as a history teacher. Megan aims to break out of the ivory tower of academia and bring ancient Mesopotamia to the world, ably assisted by her husband, Dr. Joshua Bowen. Welcome, Megan and Joshua.
Absolutely. Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
Awesome. So maybe we could start off with some introductions. Tell me, well, we already know who you are, but tell me who you are, what your academic background is, personal background, whatever you see fit.
Sure. So I'm Megan. I grew up just north of London. And despite a brief foray into art school, I went to my undergraduate degree is in ancient history, which covers the classics, Egyptology and Assyriology. And I went from wanting to be a classicist and focusing on Greek mythology to Assyriology because my undergraduate advisor at the time told me, well, they've really discovered everything there is to discover for Greece. But Assyriology has all of these untranslated texts, and we really need people just like you to do that kind of work. And I was like, you know what? That sounds amazing. So I did that. I did a master's degree with him in Birmingham in the UK. And then I came to Johns Hopkins University, which is where I met Josh, and got 7 years into a PhD program. I have most of a dissertation written on my computer hard drive. And then I decided that actually I was killing myself doing a PhD. So I graduated with a master's degree. And yeah, I'm focusing on public outreach instead, which is, I think, much more my speed. I love it.
And I'm Joshua Bowen. I sort of help out with Digital Hammurabi now. My background is fundamentalist evangelical Christianity. And so I obviously grew up here in the States. And, you know, I went to Liberty University, very conservative evangelical school, got my bachelor's degree there. Then I went to another conservative evangelical school, Capital Bible Seminary. While I was there, I got a master's in theology, which was focused on Hebrew Bible, Old Testament studies. So, of course, I ended up taking 6 years of Greek and 6 years of Hebrew, and then I took Aramaic and Syriac and Ugaritic and Akkadian, and so the languages were sort of my thing. So with that under my belt, I got into Johns Hopkins in the Assyriology program and minored in Hebrew Bible because of my background in it. So now I graduated in 2017 with my PhD, and I tend to spend a lot of time online sort of working against bad apologetics, Christian apologetics. And so, you know, my background in the Hebrew Bible really helps with that. But of course, given my background in the Assyriology, bringing in the wider ancient Near East, it's also really useful. But, you know, our channel is dedicated really, for the most part, to the ancient Near East broadly. So we have a very popular Learn to Read Ancient Sumerian series, which is by far the most popular series on the channel, which is surprising. We wrote a book, Learn to Read Ancient Sumerian, which is also very popular. Volume 2 is coming out very soon. So yeah, that's sort of what we do, trying to make the ancient Near East and the Hebrew Bible
accessible and available to people who don't have the time, energy, or money to go to grad school.
Yeah. And I will say, from personal experience, my academic background is in history, but it's the history of science, so it's modern history. But of course, you know, teaching high school, I'm required to teach all of history. And so I find myself in the awkward position of having to teach like ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia. And Digital Hammurabi's videos have been very, very helpful. So I think they're an excellent resource for educators as well. Of course, I'll link the channel. Yeah, excellent stuff. So I would like to start off with a non-historical question, but I would like to get y'all's perspective on this, because one of the things that happens, especially with ancient history, I don't encounter this so much with modern, well, I don't encounter this at all in my area, but with ancient history, because of how closely linked ancient history is with some of these religious traditions, I find oftentimes the line between religion and history get blurred a lot. So my first question, and feel free to interpret this however you see fit, what is the difference between quote unquote religion and quote unquote history, or is there a difference?
I think there's absolutely a difference. I think a lot of the people that we kind of argue with online would dispute that statement quite strongly. So for me, I am a Christian, I'm Episcopalian. But for me, the value of the Old Testament is primarily historical. I'm not saying that it is a work of history. I'm saying that it is an ancient historical text and should be treated as such. And when I'm reading it as an historian, I try and treat it in the same way that I would treat, say, the Epic of Gilgamesh. What genre is this particular section of the book? When was it written? Why was it written? I mean, who wrote it is always, well, impossible, but like what kind of person wrote it? And use it to shed light on how people lived thousands of years ago, rather than take it and say, oh, Genesis is an accurate account of the creation of the earth and mankind. For me, history is rooted in evidence, things you can point to and say, this is the evidence we have. This is how we interpret that evidence, and kind of a certain amount of debate and discussion as to the different conclusions different academics come to, which I think is something that a lot of people don't quite understand. History isn't this cut and dried thing, especially not super ancient history, because it's so far removed from our own time. It can be very difficult to get at what actually happened. And two academics looking at the same data points can come to very different conclusions. So one of the things that happens when new information comes to light is that people sit and they research it, they write about it, and through that kind of dialogue, we arrive at a consensus of what most academics think this evidence means, what most academics think probably happened during any given time period. And for me, you can't then say, well, my religion requires that I believe X about history. I think a lot of people do that, and I understand why they do that, but I do think that it is very important to try as far as possible to be aware of your bias, especially your religious bias, and mitigate against it when you're looking at the ancient world as much as you can.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a really good example of this distinction that we can draw. In the third millennium, there's this conflict that we read about in inscriptional evidence between these two cities, Umma and Lagash. And they call it the Umma-Lagash border conflict, because there are these fields that sit in between the two city-states. And
Assyriologists are also really good at naming stuff.
Yes,
you'll notice we have some
conflict.
Very catchy
really
little names for things.
But they're fighting over these fields because they use the fields for, cultivating. So the inscriptions that we have, the account of the interactions, the fighting between these two, come from the city of Lagash. So, when you read about it, the kings of Lagash are saying, our god Ningirsu gave us the power to rule over the city of Umma, and our god sent us out to fight because the city of Umma was wicked and they rebelled and they broke the treaty and all this stuff. Well, as a historian, there's like this sort of rake and shovel mentality that you have to have here, right? Like you rake the good stuff in, you rake the useful stuff in. And then you have to be careful, given what you know about propaganda, about, what people's motivations are, what texts do, to sort of shovel out the bad, right? And I think what ends up happening oftentimes is when you have a religious or a theological commitment to a particular text or group of texts, that you can sort of, rake in more than you should. And so, like, if we go to the Hebrew Bible, go to the Old Testament, think about the story of David. And, Joel Baden has a whole book out about David, and it's really interesting, professor up at Yale. But, one of the things that he likes to talk about is the story of David, where he goes and interacts with a very wealthy man named Naval. And the name Naval means fool in Hebrew, right? Which already, coincidence. And of course, he's the bad guy in the story. And what David does is David sends some men, some of his little mercenary force, to go to Naval and say, "Hey, Naval, we've been watching after your flocks, and nobody's messed with your flocks since we've been watching it. You should pay us, because of all the work that we've done." It's like a mob shakedown, right? Like mobsters go into, "Hey, store owner, that's a beautiful,
shame if something happened to
shame
it.
if that something happened to that window in the front of your store. But we've been watching it, though. We've been protecting it, so you need to pay us." But the way that spun in the Hebrew Bible is setting David up as the good guy, right? When in reality, he's the bad guy. Mm-hmm. So as a historian, when you come to that text, you could, like, I think most scholars would say, yeah, that part of the story about David probably has some historical value, right? But we can't just buy it as it stands. It won't work that way. You can't just say, "Wow, look at how amazing David was." Oh, yeah, come on. So I think that when we're talking about, and I'll be quiet after this, but when we think about the historical value that texts take that fit that genre of ancient text that probably does contain historical value, or at least more historical value than others, I think that's important to do the rake and shovel sort of, exercise. But then there are other texts that, I think we're going to talk about some of them. But things like the Exodus or the conquest accounts from Joshua, or as Megan was talking about, like the early chapters of Genesis, like these are a different genre of text. And so you can't employ the same methodology. And you certainly can't say, well, this is an inspired and inerrant text. So we have to just take it as it stands, particularly in this like fundamentalist sort of interpretation. So.
So kind of building off of that, kind of combining a point that Megan brought up with what you just kind of elaborated on there. And I found that this is difficult for a lot of people to grasp. Now, most of my teaching experience comes from the American South, or takes place in the American South. So when I teach things like ancient history, I think there are a lot of presumptions that are brought to the table. And one of the things that I've noticed quite a bit is that there's a difficulty in separating, if we're reading something like, let's take a story of David from the Hebrew Bible, or like First and Second Kings from the Hebrew Bible, something which a piece of literature that looks and reads a lot like history. And so when people read it, I think the assumption is that it's an accurate reflection of what happened. So how do you navigate that? That assumption's not there when I read something like the Epic of Gilgamesh with my students. Like, yeah, how do you navigate that?
So I think that one of the things that can be very useful to hold in your mind is that history is a modern invention. Mm-hmm. There wasn't a genre of historical writing in the ancient world, at least not the way that we know it, and probably not until classical Greece. And even then, it's like with any writing, you have to bear in mind who's writing it and why they're writing it. Even when you're looking at modern works of history, everything is written from a specific perspective, and people try to be as objective as they possibly can, but it's very difficult to do that. And in the ancient world, there wasn't even that attempt. It's just a different mindset. So thinking about the work you're reading as just not being history as we understand it is probably I think one of the easiest ways to go about that. And then you have to kind of consider what genre it might fit into instead. If it's not history, then what is it trying to do, and how is it doing that? And can we use what's being written to understand actual like historical events? So if you look at royal inscriptions from Mesopotamia, by and large, they're very propagandistic. They are written or commissioned by the king. So they're going to portray him in a very favorable light. It's going to show him as being kind of chosen by the gods. And there like maybe stories like the Sargon birth legend is very, very similar to the story of Moses. The king was kind of found and raised up by the goddess Ishtar, and kind of that is giving him a backstory that explains why he was then chosen to become king, because he didn't come from a royal family. But within those propagandistic texts, they do contain historical facts, and they do contain details about military campaigns, about building expeditions, or well, trade expeditions and building projects carried out by the king. Now they're presented as being carried out for the glory of the gods, being kind of divinely mandated. But if you separate the action from the given kind of reason, you can see you can get a very good idea of like historical events. And then you can go and look at why they are telling you this, and why they're telling you that the gods told them to do this. And it kind of gives you a really interesting picture of what royalty was in ancient Mesopotamia and how it operated and what their purpose was seen to be.
Yeah, I mean, if you go out to a schoolyard and two kids get in a fight, like a fist fight, particularly like in high school or something, and then you go afterwards and you hear one of them talking, oh man, you should see the other guy, I really gave it to him, and of course he's got all these bruises and he's all cut up, and so he's got to make sense. Yeah, he got in a couple of good blows, but man, I was bobbing and weaving, right? But you listen to the other guy, and the other guy's like, oh, I really took him out. Well, I mean, nobody should listen to either of them and say, how did it go again? Okay, so you hit him and it was, okay, say it slower. You're taking both of these accounts in and you're saying, okay, so there was a fight, right? Like I think we can say that. And it looks like both of them got some good punches in, right? But, and so we see this sort of thing, between like the Egyptians and the Hittites, right? You have texts that talk about when the Egyptians fought the Hittites, the Egyptians are saying that they won and they were amazing, and the Hittites, of course, are saying, no, we won, we're the best. What can we say about that? Well, we have to sort of separate. Okay, what's the propaganda? What are the texts doing? All right, so we can say there was this battle, probably. We can really rely on that. I think that's pretty good. In the same way with the Lagash border conflict, there was probably, a dispute about these fields, right? It makes sense why they're trying to address those things. But I think it's when we come to texts, particularly like the Old Testament, that people have interpretive models, particularly like more conservative interpretive models, that revolve or are based on some type of inerrancy or inspiration. It becomes more difficult, I think, for people to be more objective, because when you see things like God miraculously delivered, Jerusalem from the Assyrian king, well, they want that to be the reason, right? It was a miracle. So there you go. That's why it got delivered, because Yahweh worked on behalf of the people. It's like, well, yeah, did he though? What's another possible explanation? And so I think that's where, honestly, in those circumstances, what I like to say is, let's look at a Neo-Assyrian royal inscription. How do you interpret that? You cool with that being Asher delivering the new Assyrian king? Or what do you think that is? No, oh yeah, it's propaganda. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink, So.
An example that I often give, and feel free to correct me. I'm okay with this being a bad example, but I tell people when we read things like this. Also, you talked about interpretive framework. I think we also have to remember the interpretive framework of the people writing the text. That it's often, even if it's a couple of decades after the fact, that there's a certain narrative that they're conveying or that they want to convey to present a certain picture. It's no different from a narrative of American exceptionalism in the 20th century, or the United States participation in World War I or World War II is often spun in a particular light to present us as being, I say us, Americans, sorry, Megan, as being, the saviors that swoop in and we deserve all the credit and accolades and all that stuff. Is it a
I'd say my
similar?
grandfather did have some choice words about that particular event.
Wait, that's not what happened?
Touchy subject. I'm sorry. Yeah.
I'm teasing.
But I mean, would you see that as a similar thing, that you have these, in this case, these ancient Hebrew writers that look back at, let's say, the Assyrian invasion and say, okay, well, maybe this was divine punishment for our nation's sins or something? Is that kind of a similar?
Yeah, I would say so.
Mm-hmm.
So speaking of which, let's kind of maybe transition to talk about some examples.
Mm-hmm.
Probably the most prominent example of various interpretations of a historical document being the Book of Genesis. I don't think I've ever heard so many wide translations of a single couple of passages in some cases. So let's start off big picture. Tell me, what is the Book of Genesis in your own opinion, expert opinion? Kind of where does it fit in within the ancient Middle Eastern context?
Why don't you start?
Okay.
I'll chip in.
So Genesis is like one of the two, certainly major portions of Genesis represent one of the two, origin stories of the nation of Israel. And in its like final canonical form as it stands now, when you flip open your Bible, it's edited together in such a way to show how Yahweh began with the world in general, dealing with all humanity, not separating anybody out as special, just dealing with the entirety of humanity. And humanity failed, specifically through sin and rebellion, right? And as they failed, God eventually said, okay, I'm not going to work with humanity as a whole anymore. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select out one nation, one people group that are going to be my chosen people. And I'm going to work through them. They're going to be my special chosen nation. Of course, that's the nation of Israel. And so when you get to Genesis chapter 12, Abraham, comes out of Mesopotamia and goes into the land of Canaan. And that's where Yahweh establishes him, right? And the story progresses through showing how the nation of Israel began to build. The patriarchs, were given these promises and promises of things to come, and numerous seed that would be greater than all the sands on the shore of the sea. And as the book of Genesis ends, it ends with the patriarchs and that family ending up down in Egypt, which transitions them into the other origin story of the nation of Israel, which is the Exodus. And I think a good argument can be made for looking at these as two different origin stories that are being sort of brought together. How that happened, like, from an editorial standpoint, way beyond this. But I think that's what Genesis is doing, is trying to give why Israel specifically, and it's drawing down to that point and then showing how it builds up.
And when we're looking at how it fits into the wider Near East, you can look at certain narratives in there, like the story of Noah, great example. It's a Near Eastern myth. It just is. It has borrowed heavily, consciously or otherwise, from Mesopotamian mythology. You've got the flood narrative. We have like two different versions of that from Mesopotamia that way predates any biblical copies that exist. They're a very strong continuation of motifs, shall we say. You've got the birds flying out and coming back again. And the interesting way, or the interesting thing for me about how these stories are presented in the Hebrew Bible, is that they've been flipped, they've been shifted to portray Yahweh in a specific light. So the Mesopotamian flood narrative, you can see it in Gilgamesh, is probably the most famous example, but it shows how the gods essentially just get angry because they can't sleep properly and decide, we're just going to kill all humanity because why not? And they're very capricious. There's not a lot of like forethought and logic, and it's not like a kind thing, obviously, to do, like flood the whole world. And then afterwards they realize, oh, there is no one to give us offerings. There's no one to praise us anymore. This was a bad idea. So it kind of ends with the survivor, Unapishtim, kind of praising the gods, because that's what humans are supposed to do. And in Genesis, it gets kind of reversed almost, so that Yahweh doesn't want to do this. He doesn't, like, it's our own fault. It's humanity's fault for being sinful and wicked. It's not because he just felt like it that morning. It's very much phrased as, this is the last resort. You're forcing my hand and I have to do this for your own good.
Yeah. And there's a lot to those first 11 chapters of Genesis, that thing called the Primeval History. And I mean, we can talk about that if you want, but I think the big thing to remember, kind of bringing this back to the whole historical context, another way that we sort of get into, whether a particular text is representing historical reality or if it's just, sort of strict mythology, besides the genre itself, besides how the text reads itself, is archaeology, right? So you could read through the conquest accounts and be like, okay, I mean, like, this looks like
historical looking.
Yeah, this looks like
these places exist.
Yeah, I mean, like, Neo-Assyrian royal inscriptions look a lot like this. Like, think about Sennacherib's campaign, and this looks, a lot like this. So maybe we should, and scholars did for, of course, a long time, conclude that there's probably was this like blitz sort of campaign that Joshua did. And then, of course, as archaeologists made their way through various sites in Palestine, it became clear over time that, this doesn't really work. And so then you have to reevaluate, what is it that the Exodus story is doing? What is it that the conquest story is doing? And, engage with it on that level. So that's, I think, another factor to this.
So you mentioned that division of the book of Genesis, and we could dig a little bit into this just because I think this is super fascinating. So is the first 11 chapters?
11.
11 is the kind of the primeval is what you called it, the kind of mythologized past. You see a lot of stories there that resemble what we would call like or classify as myths in other cultures. So like, how would you approach, again, I would like to take this in a historical context. We talked a little bit about the flood narrative and influences from Epic of Gilgamesh, but also how the book of Genesis plays with those traditional accounts a little bit to present a different picture of Yahweh. What about like, I don't know, Tower of Babel, the creation story? Do we see other similar parallels?
Yeah.
Near Eastern context.
So I just finished volume 2 of the Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament. Okay. And there's a chapter in that volume dedicated to, it's called like, did the Old Testament plagiarize? Something like that. You know, something nice and neutral.
Right. Little tongue in cheek, but...
I hate that term.
That's why I used it. No,
I know, because I have to edit and proofread it.
Yeah.
Plagiarism. Absolutely not.
But that's what I say. You know, it's not plagiarism. You got to keep people interested. But one of the things that I write about is just this topic, and of course, this wasn't my idea. There's a scholar by the name of Ronald Hendel that wrote about this, I think in 2005, maybe. And of course, he's building on the work of others. But essentially what scholars would see when they look at Genesis 1 through 11 is it's a polemic against Mesopotamian thought and ideology, right? So if you think about what Mesopotamia values, what the civilizations, you know, the Sumerians, the Akkadians, you know, you think about the Assyrians, Babylonians, like what is it that, if you read the Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, what's the focus? The focus of the Epic of Gilgamesh is this inclusio in the story, right? The way that it opens is the way that it closes, right? Look at the city. Look at the walls. Civilization is the peak, right? That the city
urban civilization specifically.
Yeah. And it's all focused, all the movement is toward the city. It's all toward being more civilized and being less what's
nomadic?
Like if you think about Enkidu, for example, in the story, Enkidu is out in the wild, right? He's mostly animal. And what is his movement? His movement is, in the story, toward the city, right? Shamhat comes out, has sex with him for 7 days, or 6 days and 7 nights, depending on which version you read. And he loses that innocence, that more animalistic side, and becomes civil, right? He gets dressed, he eats bread, he drinks beer, and now he's really somebody. And then, you know, Shamhat says, let me take you to Gilgamesh, to the city of Uruk, right? And then that's when he hits his peak, right? Is now he's there in the city. So the movement is toward the city, and that movement is good. When you think about the first 11 chapters of Genesis, the movement is still toward the city from innocence, right? Think about the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, they're innocent, they're naked. And the movement is away from that, right? They eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they learn things, they get clothed. So the movement is away from innocence towards civilization, right? And ultimately culminating in the city, Genesis 11 with the Tower of Babylon, right? All the movement
is very subtle.
Yeah, very subtle. It's all movement toward the city, but it's bad, right? It's negative. It's never thought of as a good thing. And in fact, in the end, with the Tower of Babel, Yahweh comes down and disperses them, right? And so it's a polemic. We're not supposed to be moving toward the city. And so what happens with Abraham, right? Abram where is he? He's in Ur of the Chaldees, right? He's in southern Mesopotamia. And Yahweh calls him out. So he leaves Babylonia and he comes into Canaan. And what does he do? Does he go to a city? No, he's wandering around, right? He's wandering around. And this is what the story is doing, is it's a polemic, it's working against the idea of Mesopotamia. And again, none of these ideas are mine. I'm just, telling you what scholars have said about this. But it's really important, I think, when you engage with the text, because you stop reading it for, all right, now, so what happened in the past? Okay, so Yahweh created what did he do on day 3? Okay, so how do we make that square with the fact that plants, no, just forget all that, right? Think about it. It's a literary text and it's doing something. What is it doing?
That was very, that'll preach. That was very, I was getting a little moved there. No, that was super interesting. Epic of Gilgamesh, by the way, one of my all-time favorite
it's a good
pieces
one.
of literature. It's so good. It's amazing also how it's crazy how much people like. I usually read this with my high schoolers, and it's crazy how much they're like, oh, how much they relate to it, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, geeking out a little bit. So let's talk about maybe the transition from Abraham to Moses, and I'd also like to bring up the connection that was made earlier between Moses and Sargon, I believe it is, right? So maybe also explore the other connections there, if y'all would like to speak on that some.
Well, I've talked for a while. Do you want me to go first? Or?
Yeah.
Okay.
He does more of the biblical stuff, though.
Sorry.
I can share my thoughts, but you're going to get a lot more information from him.
I'll ask you about Sargon.
Yeah, I'm faced with it so often. That's the thing. So the story of the Exodus is, if you have the nation of Israel being chosen, Genesis shows why they got chosen, right? The story of the Exodus is how'd they come out? How'd they get into Canaan? Now, there are lots of different theories about the Exodus, right? There's a book out. It was published, I think, in 2015, called The Exodus from a Transdisciplinary Approach, something like that. And it was essentially just a conference where all of the specialists that work in the Exodus, the story of the Exodus, came together and gave papers on what they thought. Brilliant conference. But, everybody's going to say, almost everybody's going to say, if there is some historical kernel, if there's some historical value, if there was something or some things like an Exodus from Egypt, probably would have happened in the 13th century. But, more than, obviously it's not 2.5 million people walking out. Obviously they're not wandering around the desert for 40 years. There are a couple of evangelical holdouts, but, those are strongly or heavily critiqued by other scholars. But what they would, again, I think that's missing the point, trying to, go to this and say, well, historically, how does this piece together? I think that's missing the point. Because the Exodus is designed in such a way, it's constructed in such a way as to show God powerful, Yahweh powerful on behalf of his people, even when they don't deserve it. right? And that's a very powerful story, and it's one that we relate to. I have a chapter in volume 2 of this book on the Exodus, and one on the conquest and the archaeology behind it all. But one of the things that I talk about in the beginning of the chapter is my father loves to sing when he works. He loves to sing, "Oh, my Lord knows the way through the wilderness. All I got to do is follow." Right? Those are the only words that he knows of that song. But he sings them with great gusto, right? And it's very meaningful to him because he sings it at moments where things aren't going great, but he's going to trust that his God, I guess he's an evangelical Christian, that his God is going to deliver him from this sometimes oppressive state. He's going to bring him out because God is faithful. And all I have to do is follow his direction. Of course, that's the story of the Exodus. And so when we think about Moses as a character, like, was there a guy named Moses? Maybe. Does it matter?
Did he write the Pentateuch?
No.
Absolutely not.
Of course not. And for people listening, like, I think a relevant comparison here is the Epic of Gilgamesh. Was there a king of Uruk named Gilgamesh? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Most likely, yes.
Did he go to the ends of the earth and meet the man who survived the flood and get the plant of life?
Yeah, I mean,
probably not. No,
like, come on, like that. Nobody wrestles with that one, right? Nobody sits around and goes, "I wonder what those trees with the jewels." Yeah, the scorpion man that guarded the pass. I mean, yeah, Zachariah Sitchin does, right? But no, I'm just kidding.
No, they were just aliens.
Yeah, they're just aliens. But I think what we've got to be able to do is look at the story of the Exodus for its literary value, and to be able to say why is it that this story endures? Yeah, in two major religions of the world. And I don't know a lot about
Islam. Same as when you look at Gilgamesh, though.
Yeah,
it is still relevant. It still moves people today.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Yeah.
And the fact that it's not historically accurate or is not a blow-by-blow account of something that actually happens doesn't matter, because it is important to people. And I think that that's far more interesting from an academic standpoint, and I think far more valuable from just like a human perspective.
Yeah, that's right.
Then, well, is it factually true?
Yeah.
Anyway, Sargon.
Yeah. So what's the I think how to put this. I oftentimes read I have my students read sorry, I got pen all over my hand. That looks weird. What is the Sargon's birth account? Where does that come from?
It's just a standalone text.
I think it comes from it's probably down around the 12th century. It might be later. It might be, even in the first millennium, but I think it's probably Standard Babylonian. I haven't looked at it in a while.
It's definitely written after Sargon lived. And I don't know off the top of my head if there's good evidence for it being in circulation when he was alive. But Sargon of Akkad was kind of the first king to really unify northern and southern Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia's natural state is a bunch of little city-states, some bigger than others. But it kind of has periods where a particular ruler manages to unify either a group of them or the whole region. But it's it's difficult, and it's like herding cats, because they don't want to be unified. They're perfectly happy being themselves, and it kind of changes through the years. Like, I feel like the New Assyrian period is a nice, good, long, solid chunk of time when actually it was just an empire. But Sargon was the first king to really kind of do the unification thing, and he's kind of he grows up as like a figure of legend in later times because he was the first, because he was so momentous. So you get a couple of different stories about where he came from, because he wasn't royal. And I mean, like we don't really know how he came to power or why he did. But you have two stories. One of them is probably closer to the truth and says that he was like an official of a local king and kind of was very trusted by this king and ended up taking over after he died. And one of them is the like the Moses story where he's sealed in a basket with pitch and floated down the river as a baby, and he's found by a gardener and raised in the temple. Raised like in the temple gardens, and the goddess Ishtar sees him and loves him, and she's the reason that he becomes king, because she makes him king. That's what she does. But yeah, it's I like it. It's a good story,
and definitely the traditions, like this mythological background, legendary background to Sargon, definitely goes. There's a Sumerian story and it talks about this. It definitely goes back at least early part of the second millennium. But
Sargon was what?
So Sargon's like 24th century, like 2350 maybe. 2370. I can't remember.
Early.
Yeah. Can't believe I don't remember that precisely what year he reigned. Gosh, what's wrong with me? But yeah, I mean, we know that it was very close to the time of the worldwide flood, right? We know that much. Watch my eye. I'm winking.
So what's the deal with the I guess you can call it a trope of the desperate mother that places the baby in a basket, sends it down the river? Is this supposed to like reveal something about Sargon and or Moses's character? Is it supposed to like help us relate to them due to the fact that they're not like born into privilege or born out of privilege or something?
Yeah, I mean, it's like it's an exposure story.
Yeah, they were expected to die.
And if you think, I think the big thing to remember here, if you think about the name Sargon, right? That's
Sharuki in Akkadian. It means the king is legitimate, which is a pretty good indication that actually no, he wasn't.
Yeah.
So he had to have a good reason. Like, I mean, his throne name is declaring his perfection as a ruler. Like, why is this man our king?
Right.
Well, he was exposed at birth, and he was he was so divinely chosen that he didn't die and was made king despite all of these hardships.
And he really is legitimate. Seriously, like that's like you could see him sort of standing there. I really am. And I'm just kidding. I doubt that's what happened. Yeah. But I think that's a really important point to all of this, is recognizing that these stories are designed. It's really, really interesting to read through the literature, and we don't have it in here. There's a book called Before the Muses, and it's you're gonna go get it? Megan's gonna go get it. And it's an Akkadian anthology of literature. Of Akkadian literature, an anthology of Akkadian literature, translated by Benjamin Foster. And it's not, for what you get, it's not that pricey, but it's all in English translation. It's got neat little bits of commentary. Thank you, sweetheart. Before the Muses.
You could kill someone with that book.
Yeah, you really could. But it's well, you talk about it.
Well, for anyone who is even vaguely interested in Mesopotamia, it's like my number one recommendation, because it has all major and like most of the minor works of Akkadian literature. It's got commentary, like Josh was saying. Like, Foster sits you down and kind of explains what this actually means for people who aren't like Assyriologists. And does it have information about the tablets, or is that just?
Yeah, I mean.
Yeah, so it gives you like information about where these texts were found,
or at least places that you can go to see,
which is valuable, because a lot of the time when you're reading literature in translation, it's difficult to find the original sources, because if it's in translation for a popular level audience, like generally people don't really they're not terribly interested. But if you do want to know, this is a really easy way, because he gives you all the references. You can go and see, oh, this is like compiled from 5 different tablets, which I think is interesting.
Yeah. Also, it has the poor man of Nippur in it, which is my favorite Akkadian story of all time.
I'm not familiar. No.
Yeah.
There's also a dramatized version on YouTube that was done at Oxford, I think, and it's in Akkadian. Like the students perform it in Akkadian, and it's marvelous. But you should give a synopsis, because it's a wonderful thing.
We've got a video where I do like a synopsis of it on the channel. It's an early video, so it probably is really terrible audio. But essentially, there's this poor man in the city of Nippur, and thus the really creative name, the poor man of Nippur.
I told you we're good at titles. Very good.
And he goes to the mayor to try to, get assistance. And the mayor really disrespects him and like kicks him out, and it's bad. So he swears revenge. He's going to get revenge 3 times on the mayor. And I won't like go through.
Like he goes in disguises and ends up like beating the mayor disguised as a doctor or something. And
he goes
it's
in
wonderful.
I'll give a couple. He goes in the first time dressed as a really wealthy person. He's got this box, and it's clear that it's supposed to have gold inside the box, right? And it's sealed. So during the night, he opens up the box and there's like pigeons inside of it or something. He lets the pigeons go, and then he wakes up the mayor and says, "Someone's stolen my gold," and he beats the mayor, right? Because look, somebody stole his gold, right? And so the mayor then gives him a gold bar to replace it, and then another one on top of it because it got stolen under his watch or whatever. So then he leaves, goes and shaves his head, and comes back, because that's what physicians looked like. And he comes and says, "I'm a physician. I'm here to treat the mayor." And to convince him, he says, "I can tell you without you showing me where your wounds are."
Oh.
But it's because he inflicted them on him, right? But the mayor doesn't know that. So he says, "Now my treatments only work in the dark, back in a cave or so. Like we have to go deep, and
where no one can hear you."
So he goes in there and he ties him down. He beats him again, thrashes him from head to toe, is what it says. Anyway, so it's just a really clever story. I shouldn't say it's fun. It's violent.
Assault, So you've mentioned quite a few resources kind of throughout our discussion here. If someone were to come up to you and say, like, "I'm interested in learning about the ancient Near East," what's some solid books, videos? Obviously, we have your channel, but other than your channel, what would you recommend?
Thorkild Jakobsen, Treasures of Darkness, is an older book, but it is a good, solid introduction, very readable for people who aren't academically minded. I think that's like the best place to start if you're just generally interested. Literature specifically before the Muses, there's also a website called ETCSL, which is the Electronic Sumerian
Electronic Text Corpus of Sumerian Literature. Again, very inventive.
But it's free. It's got translations of all the major Sumerian texts, which is invaluable. And it will also show you like the transliterations, so how they would have been pronounced in Sumerian, which is interesting if you are a language kind of person.
So this is shameful. It is. I embrace the shamefulness of it. But this book, The Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament, I don't know who wrote it. No, I'm just kidding. It's ours, obviously.
I didn't know you actually wrote that. Okay.
Yeah, it's designed to be an introduction to the Hebrew Bible, to the Old Testament. And one of the things that I do is chapter 2 is a history of the ancient Near East in very
plain language,
popular, readable language. If people are interested in the history of like Mesopotamia and Egypt and Syro-Palestine, I have a chapter in each of the volumes that's dedicated to that in that sort of language. And if you read through that one, then I would recommend moving on to Mark van der Meerop's work. There's a cat here. Van der Meerop has a book called The History of the Ancient Near East, and it's like a standard. Everybody reads it.
And it's a textbook, so it's updated annually or semi-annually. So it's...
But I mean this, like, I'm not just saying it to sell a book or something, but like the reason I wrote that chapter that way is so that an interested non-specialist can pick it up, not be bored out of their soul, and get a sweeping overview of ancient Mesopotamia and its involvement with the rest of the Near East. Like, we talk about things like the Amarna period, the interactions of the major powers, and how Canaan fits into that. But it gives this introduction so that you can then turn to a more detailed work and have it all
You're kind of oriented already.
Yeah.
You don't kind of, because it's a lot of history. The ancient Near East, it's geographically huge. And you're looking at 3,000 years with most historical textbooks, which is, it's a lot to kind of get your head around.
And there's one other book, and it's by, oh my God, Elio Oppenheim, and it's called, like, it's orange, and we did a whole series on it on our channel where I sort of walked through it. Portrait of a Dead Civilization. Portrait of a Dead Civilization. Again,
Yes.
slightly
Also
dated,
very good.
but an excellent introduction to Mesopotamia, because he goes through everything: literature, history, the economy, metallurgy, like omens, medicine, like anything and everything. He's gonna talk about it, and in language that you can get. But then we sort of took the major parts of it and summarized it in these short little videos on our channel. So if people are interested in that, they can.
I will say, if people want something more in depth and they're not afraid of academic writing, freely available online is something called ORAC, which is the Open Richly Annotated Cuneiform Corpus, which I know, I'd like, fantastic title, really. But it has a whole host of different projects put up for free by various academics. So you can scroll through and kind of just dip in and out of things that look interesting to you. And finally, my final amazing acronym is CDLI.
Yes.
Which is the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative, which works to digitize and make available online as many cuneiform documents as they possibly can. So they have photographs, they have line drawings, they have bibliographies. And that's more for if you are interested in reading cuneiform yourself. But it's also a good place to kind of just get started and look at what kinds of material culture we have, and really look at what this writing was put on, because I think that's something that often is not made clear enough to people when they're learning about the ancient world. We have...
These are replicas.
Yeah, so this is by a very talented Sumerologist,
Jeremiah
Peterson. He has an Etsy store, which is called Ancient Texts
Modern
Scribe. Yeah. And this is a replica of a royal inscription. It weighs a ton.
It was my birthday present.
It was your birthday present. We give great birthday presents in this house. But it's really nice to be able to look at something and understand that the words you're reading in your book, like, they weren't just written on flat sheets of paper. They were written on monuments. They were written on clay letters. They were written on statues. And CDLI is a really nice place to go to kind of get a feeling for just the wide variety of objects that were suitable as writing surfaces.
And my last recommendation, it's a bit more up to date. There are Oxford handbooks, lots of different Oxford handbooks of this and that, which are amazing. One that is excellent for this topic is the Oxford Handbook of Cuneiform Culture. and Eleanor Robeson and
I don't remember who else.
It's terrible. Edited it, and it's 2011, I think, 2010, 2011. It's wonderful because it goes through so many different aspects of cuneiform culture, Mesopotamian culture, and so if you're looking for a slightly meatier introduction to like a wide variety of topics, that's the place to go.
All right.
People never ask us for recommendations
No,
again
they don't.
because we're just like, here is our entire library.
No, that was I greatly appreciate it,
And I can send you links to the online stuff
Yeah.
if that's helpful.
He's gonna
Awesome.
cut all this out.
no.
Don't blame
Delete.
them. Don't blame them.
I always love to ask for recommendations at the end of the videos, and any of the links I'll put in the description of the video. Well, thank you both for agreeing to come on. I didn't expect to laugh this much in this conversation, but that was yeah. Thanks so much. I really appreciate it. I'm sure a lot of people would get a lot out of this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for
Our
having
pleasure.
us. Yeah,
Yes.
I love doing stuff like this. It's a lot of fun. And thank you, by the way, for being a teacher, because
Yes.
you guys are saints as far as I'm concerned.
Tip of the spear. That's what I'm saying.
You don't have to thank me. I literally wouldn't be. It's the only thing I can imagine myself doing. So
That's great.